Tonight, we are going to stay inside your own wardrobe. Nothing there is new, not the shapes. A shirt today closes the same way a shirt closed 600 years ago, and it closes that way because of a small invention that took Europe about 4,000 years to think of. And almost everything you are wearing has a part on it that does nothing at all. There are buttons on your sleeve that hold nothing shut. There is a small hole in the front of your jacket that no longer takes anything. There is a pocket the size of 2 fingers inside another pocket. There is a fold at the bottom of a trouser leg that was once mud and is now a style. None of this is decoration invented by somebody. Each one is a leftover. The job ended and the shape stayed because clothes are copied more often than they are designed. 14 things in the order they arrived. Nothing to work out and nothing to wait for. If you fall asleep before the end, that is fine. The button spent 4,000 years holding nothing. The button is very old. The buttonhole is not. In the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, in what is now Pakistan, archaeologists found small curved discs of seashell with 2 holes bored through them. They are about 5,000 years old. They are buttons in shape and in material, and they were sewn onto cloth. What they were not is fasteners. They were ornaments, or they were toggles that passed through a loop of cord. The same is true across the ancient world. Greeks and Romans had buttons, and in almost every case, the button sat next to a loop, or it simply sat there looking like a button. Clothes themselves were held on by other means: pins, brooches, belts, a length of cloth wound and tucked. If you look at Roman clothing, almost none of it is cut to the body. It is draped, and draped clothing does not need to be fastened along a line. The buttonhole is a slit cut into cloth and then sewn around its edge so that it does not tear. It appears in Europe in the 13th century, and the oldest clear examples come from German lands. It is a small thing to invent, and it took about 4,000 years, counting from the buttons at Mohenjo-Daro. What it did was immediate. A row of buttonholes lets a garment be closed along its whole length, tightly, at any point you like. That means clothing can be cut to fit the body instead of hanging from the shoulders. Within a century, European clothes changed shape completely. Tailoring, in the sense of cutting flat cloth into pieces that follow a body, arrives with the buttonhole and not before it. So the button did not fasten clothing for 4,000 years. Then somebody cut a hole beside it, and the way people were shaped in cloth changed inside one lifetime. Your pocket used to be a bag on a string. For most of the history of clothes, there were no pockets in them at all. What people carried, they carried in a pouch. The pouch hung from the belt, or it hung from a cord tied around the waist, and it was a separate object that you bought separately and lost separately. In inventories of the 15th century, a purse is listed the way a knife is listed. It is a thing, not a part of a coat. The pocket sewn into a garment arrives in men's clothing in the 17th century, and it arrives because men's clothing had by then acquired something to sew it into. A coat with a lining has a space between 2 layers of cloth, and a slit in the outer layer opens into that space. Once the slit exists, the bag can be hidden inside the coat rather than hung outside it. Women's clothing went the other way and stayed there for 200 years. A woman's pockets were a pair of flat bags tied on a tape around the waist, worn underneath the skirt. The skirt had slits cut in it so the hand could reach through. They were roomy. They held a great deal. And because they were separate, they were left to daughters in wills. Then, around the 1790s, dresses became narrow and straight, and there was no longer any room under the skirt for a bag full of things. The tie-on pocket had nowhere to go. What replaced it was a small bag carried in the hand, and the word used for it at the time was reticule. That divide never really closed. Men's clothes kept the pocket sewn inside the garment. Women's clothes kept the bag carried outside it. The handbag is not an accessory that was added. It is a pocket that was evicted. The Side Your Buttons Are On is a story nobody wrote down. Take any shirt made for a man and any shirt made for a woman. On the man's shirt, the buttons are on the right and the holes are on the left. On the woman's shirt, it is the other way around. This is close to universal in factory clothing, and it has been for about 150 years. There is no document that says why. There are 3 explanations, all of them repeated confidently, and all of them are stories told long after the fact. The first says that wealthy women were dressed by a servant, and the servant stood facing them, so the buttons were put on the side that suited the servant's right hand. It is the most quoted explanation. It has a hole in it. Most women in the 19th century were not dressed by anybody, and factory clothing was made for them too. The second says that a man kept his sword hand free, and a coat that closes left over right lets the right hand reach inside without catching. This explains men's coats. It does not explain why women's clothing had to be the opposite. The third says that a woman held an infant on the left arm, leaving the right hand to open the clothing. It is plausible, and it is also unsupported. What can be said with confidence is narrow. The convention hardened when clothing began to be cut in large quantities to standard patterns, and once a pattern is standard, it does not need a reason to continue. Everything after that is copying. So the answer to a very ordinary question is that nobody knows. The side your buttons are on is one of the oldest habits in your wardrobe, and it is held in place by nothing but repetition. The heel was riding equipment. A raised heel is not a way of being taller. It is a way of not sliding out of a stirrup. A rider standing in the stirrups needs the foot to stop moving forward. A heel does that. The shelf at the back of the boot catches on the stirrup iron and locks the foot in place. Persian cavalry wore heeled riding boots for exactly this reason, and the heel had no other job. At the very end of the 1500s, a Persian embassy traveled through Europe looking for allies, and the way its riders dressed was noticed. Persian things became fashionable in European courts. Among the things copied was the boot, and the boot came with its heel. In Europe, the heel came off the horse almost immediately. Men at court wore heels while standing on flat stone floors, where the shelf at the back holds nothing. Louis XIV wore very high ones and had the heels of his inner circle painted red, so that the right to wear that particular red heel became a marker of who was close to him. Women's court dress took up the heel in the same period. Then, over the 1700s, men's clothing across Europe moved steadily towards plain dark cloth and low shoes, and men left the heel behind entirely. Women did not. That is the whole story. There is no point at which anybody decided that a heel belonged to women. Men wore it first, for a reason that involved a horse, and then men stopped, and the heel stayed where it had been left. The shape of the shoe itself has its own story, and we told it in the episode about the things you carry. For most of history, a shoe was neither left nor right. The tie arrived in Paris on somebody else's neck. In the middle of the 1600s, cavalry from Croatia were serving in the French army. They wore a length of cloth knotted at the throat. It was practical. It closed the top of the shirt, and it kept the neck warm, and it was one piece of cloth rather than a stiff collar that needed laundering and starching. Paris noticed. The French word that came out of it was cravate, and the older form of that word is very close to the word for Croat. The link is not certain in every detail, but this is the origin that the French language itself carries. What happened next was 200 years of knotting. The cravat was enormously long, wound several times, tied in front, and the way a man tied it was a public statement about how much time he had. Manuals were printed. By the early 1800s, there were books devoted to the tying of neckcloths with named knots and diagrams. The modern tie is a simplification of that, and the man usually credited with the final shape is Jesse Langsdorff, a tie maker in New York, who in 1924 patented a way of cutting the cloth. He cut it at an angle across the weave in 3 pieces so that the tie would stretch and then return to shape instead of twisting permanently. Almost every tie made since is cut that way. So the tie is a piece of soldier's neckwear, borrowed by a court, elaborated for 2 centuries, and then solved by a cutting angle. It closes a shirt that already closes with buttons. It is the clearest case in the wardrobe of a thing that outlived its job by 300 years. The collar came off because only the collar was dirty. Washing a shirt in the 1820s was a day of work. It was boiling and lye and beating and wringing and drying and starching and pressing. It was done rarely, and shirts were expensive, and both of those facts were connected to a single observation. The observation is that a shirt does not get dirty evenly. The body of it stays reasonably clean under a coat. What blackens is the collar, where the neck rubs, and the cuffs, where the wrist meets everything. In 1827, in Troy, in the state of New York, a woman named Hannah Montague cut the collar off one of her husband's shirts, washed it, and sewed it back on. Then she made the arrangement permanent, collars that attached with a stud and could be removed. The idea did not stay in the house. Troy took it up as an industry. Within decades, the town had factories making detachable collars and cuffs by the million, and it was known as the Collar City. The collars were starched to a stiffness that is hard to imagine now, and there was a whole trade of laundries built around them. The detachable collar lasted about 100 years, and it ended when washing got cheap. Once a household could put a whole shirt into a machine, the reason for separating the dirty part disappeared. What it left behind is on the shirt you are wearing. A modern shirt has a collar band, a strip of cloth, around the neck onto which the collar is sewn. That band exists because collars used to button onto it. There are shirts still made today with a small hole at the back of the neck for a collar stud that no longer exists. The turn-up at the bottom of the trousers is mud. Streets before paving were mud in any wet month, and long trousers dragged in it. The response was obvious and required no invention. You folded the bottom of the trouser leg up, twice, out of the wet, and you unfolded it when you got indoors. Somewhere around the 1890s, tailors began sewing the fold in permanently. The fold had stopped being an action and had become a feature of the garment, and once it was sewn, it needed a name. In Britain, it is a turn-up. In America, it is a cuff. The credit is usually given to the future Edward VII, caught in rain, turning his trousers up, and being copied because of who he was. There is no contemporary evidence for that story, and it belongs with the other tailoring tales in this episode. The shape is real, and the anecdote is not documented. The permanent turn-up brought one real advantage with it, and it is the reason it survived when the mud went away. The extra folded cloth is heavy. Weight at the bottom of a trouser leg makes it hang straight and stops it swinging. A tailor will tell you this today is a reason for a turn-up on a heavy wool trouser, and it is true, and it was discovered by accident from a fold made for an entirely different purpose. So the bottom of your trouser leg carries 2 extra inches of cloth folded back on itself against a street surface that no longer exists. The patent on jeans is for the rivet. The most copied garment in the world is protected by a patent that has nothing to do with the trousers. The cloth was not new. Heavy cotton twill had been woven for a long time in Europe and then in America, and it was the ordinary material of work clothing. The trouser shape was not new either. What was new was a metal rivet. Jacob Davis was a tailor in Reno, in Nevada, and his customers were miners and laborers whose trousers failed in exactly the same 2 places every time. The corners of the pockets and the base of the button fly. Those are the points where cloth is pulled in 2 directions at once. Davis began putting copper rivets at those corners, the same rivets used on horse blankets, and the trousers stopped tearing. He could not afford a patent on his own. He wrote to the merchant who supplied his cloth, Levi Strauss in San Francisco, and proposed that they file together. The patent was granted on the 20th of May, 1873, and its title is about fastening pocket openings. Not about trousers, about the corners of pockets. The name of the cloth is a separate puzzle. Denim is usually explained as a worn-down form of a French phrase meaning serge from the town of Nimes. The words line up neatly, but the chain of evidence connecting the French cloth to the American one is thin, and careful historians say so. The other half of the name is easier. Jean is a cotton fustian associated with Genoa. The rivets are still there. On a modern pair, you can find them at the front pocket corners, doing the job they were patented for in 1873. The 5th pocket held a watch. Inside the right front pocket of almost every pair of jeans in the world, there is a second, much smaller pocket. 2 fingers fit into it. Nothing else does. It was for a pocket watch, and it was there from the beginning. The trousers patented in 1873 had 4 pockets, 2 at the front, 1 at the back, and the small one for the watch. A working man who owned a watch owned one on a chain, and a waistcoat was not something he wore to work. The second back pocket, the one that makes a modern pair 5 pocket, did not arrive until 1901, so the watch pocket is older than the 5th pocket. The little one came first. Pocket watches left ordinary life in the decades after the First World War, when the wristwatch took over. We told that story in the episode about the things you carry. The pocket did not leave with them. It has now spent about a century holding coins, guitar picks, folded notes, and nothing at all. There is a small piece of evidence in the stitching, and you can check it on your own trousers. The watch pocket usually has its own rivets or its own line of reinforcement, out of proportion to anything you would put in it now. It was built to carry a heavy object that swung on a chain. It survives because removing it would cost money. A pattern that has been cut 10 million times is cheaper to keep than to change. and nobody has ever complained about a pocket. The buttons on your sleeve hold nothing. On the outside of the sleeve of a jacket, near the wrist, there are 2, 3, or 4 buttons in a row. On most jackets, they do not open anything. There is no buttonhole under them, or the buttonhole is sewn shut, and the cuff cannot be undone. 2 explanations are repeated everywhere. The first says Napoleon ordered buttons sewn onto the sleeves of his soldiers, coats to stop them wiping their noses on the cloth. The second says the buttons come from surgeons who needed to turn the cuff back to work, and so the buttons on a good jacket really do open, and the feature is called a surgeon's cuff. Neither has a contemporary document behind it. Both first appear in print long after the period they describe, and both are the kind of story that is satisfying enough to survive without evidence. What can be traced is duller. As the tailored coat took its modern shape in the 1800s, the sleeve ended in a small opening that could be closed, and buttons closed it. Then the sleeve stopped being closed at all, and the buttons stayed. Today they carry a meaning that has nothing to do with wrists. On a factory-made jacket, they are decorative. On a jacket made to measure, they usually work, and the fact that they work is treated as a quiet sign of how the jacket was made. Some men leave the last one undone to show it. That is a leftover doing a second job it was never given. The buttons closed a cuff, then stopped closing it, and are now evidence about the tailor. The hole in your lapel is a collar that closed. On the left side of a jacket, at the top of the lapel, there is a buttonhole. It is sewn properly, with the same stitching as a working buttonhole, and there is usually no button anywhere near it. The explanation is in the shape of the lapel itself. A lapel is a fold. Unfolded, and you have a coat front that closes all the way up to the throat, with a collar that stands rather than lies. That is how outdoor coats were made when weather was the main thing a coat dealt with. The buttonhole at the top of the lapel is the last hole in that row, and the button it took is often still there on the opposite side, hidden underneath. When the coat began to be worn open, the top of it folded back into the shape we now call a lapel, and the hole rolled over to the outside, where it became visible and useless at the same moment. Once it was visible, it was used. A flower put through it is called a boutonnière, which is simply the French word for buttonhole. In some countries, a small badge or ribbon goes through it. On many jackets, there is a little loop of thread on the back of the lapel behind the hole, put there to hold the stem of the flower, which means tailors are still building support for a use that came second. So the sequence runs: a hole that closed a coat against wind, then a hole that holds a flower, then a hole that holds nothing and is sewn anyway because a lapel without one looks unfinished. Zip took 20 years in a pair of boots. In 1893, Whitcomb Judson showed a fastener at the World's Fair in Chicago. It was a row of hooks and eyes, closed by a slider. It was meant for boots, and it was called a clasp locker. It did not work well. It came open, it jammed. Almost nobody bought one, and the company that made it survived by selling very few of them for 2 decades. The device that works was designed by Gideon Sundback, an engineer at that same company, and patented in 1917. He threw out the hooks. He used identical small teeth, each with a dimple on one face and a nib on the other, so that the slider pressed one tooth into the socket of the next. That is still the design. Nothing important about a metal zip has changed in 100 years. The name came from a boot. In 1923, a rubber company put the fastener on a rubber overshoe, and the marketing name was the zipper boot for the sound. The word attached itself to the fastener rather than the boot, and the company later lost the exclusive right to it because the public had adopted it as the ordinary word for the thing. Clothing was last. For over a decade, the zip was for bags, tobacco pouches, money belts, and boots, and not for garments, partly because it could not be washed and ironed like cloth, and partly because clothing is conservative. Men's trousers took it in the 1930s. So, 24 years from the first demonstration to the working patent, and another 20 before it was allowed onto ordinary clothes. It is the most used mechanism in your wardrobe, and it spent its first generation on footwear. Belt loops are younger than the aeroplane. Trousers were not held up by a belt for most of the time trousers have existed. They were held up by braces, the pair of straps over the shoulders, and the braces attached to buttons sewn on the outside of the waistband. A high waistband and a pair of straps hold cloth up without gripping the body. A belt does the opposite. It holds trousers up by squeezing. The belt itself came from the army. Military uniform used a belt at the waist for carrying and for shape, and men who had worn uniform were used to one. After the First World War, the waistline of ordinary trousers dropped, and a lower waistband sits on the hips where a belt can actually hold it. The date is documented in an unusually precise way because it happened to a mass-produced garment. Belt loops were added to Levi's work trousers in 1922, and for another 15 years, the same trousers also kept their buttons for braces because the makers did not know which way it would go. The suspender buttons came off in 1937. So the loop of cloth on your waistband is younger than powered flight, younger than the cinema, and younger than the zip that closes the trousers underneath it. It is one of the newest parts of a garment that is otherwise very old. And the older system left its own leftover. On formal trousers made properly today, there are still buttons inside the waistband for braces, on clothes that almost never meet a pair. Your t-shirt was underwear issued by a navy. The plainest garment in the world was, for about 40 years, something you were not supposed to be seen in. It began as underwear. Navies needed a light undershirt that a man could work in below deck in heat, and the United States Navy specified a white cotton crew-necked shirt with short sleeves in the 1910s. It was issued. It had no collar, no buttons, and no cuffs, which is exactly what made it cheap. The name is a description of the shape, laid flat, with the sleeves out. The garment is the letter T. The word appears in print in 1920 in a novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, listed among the things a young man takes to university. By the late 1930s, it was in mail-order catalogs, still under underwear. It came outside slowly and then all at once. Soldiers and sailors in the Second World War wore it as an outer garment in hot climates, and photographs of them doing so were everywhere. Then, in 1951, a film put an actor on screen in a plain white one for most of the picture, and after that it was clothing. What it kept from the Navy is the reason it is comfortable. There is no collar to stiffen, no placket to line, no cuff to close. Every part that a shirt has for the sake of appearance was removed to make it cheap for a man working in a hot engine room, and what was left turned out to be the most comfortable garment anyone had ever put on. Almost every other thing in this episode is a leftover, a shape that stayed after its job ended. The t-shirt is the opposite. It is a garment with nothing left over at all, and that is why it beat everything else in the wardrobe. That is 14. A hole cut beside a button, 4,000 years late. A bag on a string that became a pocket for some people and a handbag for others. A side to fasten on that nobody can explain. A heel from a stirrup. A scarf from a cavalry regiment. A collar that came off because only the collar was dirty. A fold against mud. A rivet at the corner of a pocket for a watch nobody carries, buttons that close nothing, a hole for a flower, a fastener that spent its youth on boots, a loop younger than the aeroplane, and underwear issued by a navy. If you look down at what you are wearing now, some of it is doing work and some of it is a record of work that ended. Clothes are copied more often than they are designed, and copying keeps everything, including the parts that stopped mattering. Sleep well.